Hi, today I want to talk about my video is on Pentecost. Pentecost is one of the seven annual feasts that God speaks of in the Bible. Specifically, you could look at Leviticus 23. It discusses Passover and unleavened bread, and then the remaining of the feast that go out throughout the year. There's seven total, and so I want to talk about those. And this, I'm not trying to do any in-depth study here, but just kind of an overview. So you have a little history. I think it's important. Certainly, if you don't know about the feast now, God will expect you to know them when He returns. I can guarantee you that. The fact that's in the Bible, and it tells us to treat this as uh, um, a forever feast, to recognize it forever. And so that means today and every day. And so anyway, it's a good overview. You should be aware of it. And whether or not you keep it, that's up to you. But it's something that God does command us to pay attention to. So let's get started on this. So Pentecost is one of God's seven annual holy days or feast days. It always falls on a Sabbath day. Well, actually, it's treated as a Sabbath day, but it always falls on Sunday, which I'll mention here in a moment. So just like the weekly Sabbath, God commands us to observe these days as holy convocations. So a convocation would be an assembly of people. And in this case, a holy convocation would be, of course, assembling at church. So it'd be a church service. So that's the Sabbath. Just as we would treat any other a weekly Saturday Sabbath, this is an annual Sabbath. Okay, we are not to conduct any business or engage in any manner of work. So that means that, like any other Saturday Sabbath, that you're not business-wise, you're not to be out shopping. Any emergency is certainly another matter. God totally understands, but to just arbitrarily be out on a Sabbath day, you're not supposed to be out shopping and purchasing and conducting any kind of business, and neither are you to be doing any kind of work. So that would include the Bible verse that a servile work, such as a servant might be doing. But we're servants of Christ, of course, but really it's just any kind of work that we might do. It could be yard work. It could be, of course, it could be your job, yard work, housework. You're not supposed to be doing that. It's supposed to be a day in church with fellow believers, a meal, conversation, whatever it might be. But you need to avoid the work and the business activities. And of course, I said Pentecost always occurs on a Sunday, and the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles a couple thousand years ago on a Sunday, and so that's what we continue with, Sunday annual Sabbath event. And so there's seven annual feasts, and they're all meant to remind us, seven annual feasts, of course, during the year, and they're meant to remind us of God's great plan of redemption. And of course, that means you and me. God redeems us, from our past, from our sin, and these feast events really speak to Jesus. You'll see if we can go through these throughout the year. Jesus is really a big part of these events, and it's important to understand that God really places a high value on them. So God gave this festival, as the Bible refers to it as, to His people to reveal to them that this is in this present dispensation, this particular time period, it's only the first preliminary harvest of souls, or first fruits. And of course, Jesus was the first fruit, and we will follow as first fruits upon His return. And this is also the Pentecost speaks, of course, refers, the highlight, of course, is receiving the Holy Spirit back on that day of Pentecost when the apostles were, gathering together. And then also, it's an issue of ancient wise. the first fruits would have referred to the harvest, to the barley and the harvest grain, all the various harvests that were occurring in Israel at that time. Well, let's continue with some of these points here. So in ancient days, Pentecost marked the end of the barley harvest and the beginning of the wheat harvest. And of course, now the focus is on the spiritual harvest, which would be, again, like, with us. God is calling, Matthew tells us that God has called all of us, but he's only going to choose some of us. So it's up to us, as I keep saying, we have to qualify for whatever event or whatever it is that we're looking for. We have to qualify. And recognizing this feast shows that what's involved here. So calling out of the church, or the called out ones, would be God's little flock, the first harvest, or the first fruits, the early harvest. And God's little flock, you can read about that in Luke 12:32. And again, it's not for everybody who claims to be Christian. It's just going to be a select few, relatively speaking, a smaller number. And that's God is looking for those few, those elect that have walked with Him very closely and keep all His commandments, etc. So in the Old Testament, we have three names that this Pentecost goes by. Some people, it's referred to in the Bible as Feast of Weeks, because we're going to be counting weeks. You're going to see that here in a minute or two. That's in Deuteronomy 16:16. Feast of Harvest is Exodus 23:16, and that's another name of Pentecost. And then the Day of First Fruits, that's in Numbers 28:26. So these are three phrases that do speak to the event of Pentecost. And you recall that, I mentioned there's a weekly Sabbath. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. There's the priest at the beginning, right at the end of let me back up here. Pentecost, there's a time period of 50 days between we have Passover, and the next day is Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that's a 7-day feast, or you could call it a holiday. It's a 7-day feast, and it begins with an annual Sabbath, and ends with an annual Sabbath. And so we're going to read. I have a couple of things I want to read to you regarding what we call the wave sheaf offering. That's where the priest would take a loaf of the grain, the recent harvest, and would hold it up to God to be approved by God, and of course to be blessed by God. And then after that, the harvest would continue. So this was the first of the harvest, the first fruits that were picked and then waved to God, up, skyward. So the wave sheaf was a special offering administered by the high priest, and God gives special instructions in Leviticus 23:9 through 11. So let me just read those to you. Okay. Verse 9, and the Lord said to Moses, verse 10, say to the people of Israel, when you come into the land which I give you, and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, and you may find acceptance on the morrow, which the term morrow refers to the following day, after the Sabbath. So it's the morrow after the Sabbath, which is going to be a Sunday. The priest shall wave it, and so he waves it on a Sunday, and this is the day that we begin our count for 50 days. In this case, it's 50 days, and there's not a fixed date. So every year, technically, you'd have to make that count, that 50-day count, based on when Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread occur. Now, realistically, the calendar, our lunar, our calendar that we use today, shows in recent April 8th or 9th rather, 8th I think it was Passover Day, and you count. In fact, you can get. I'll talk about this in a minute. This little card, I don't know if you can see this or not. All it is, you can find these cards they're about 3 by 4, size card, and it shows all the dates of the feast. It has a little calendar, so you can easily identify all the dates, and it's pretty handy. But also your calendar will show the dates for the Passover and for Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then you can work from those days. We're going to go through that here real quick. And again, if you wanted this card, you could contact me at BibleTruth200@gmail.com. So it's Bible, the word Bible, the word truth, one long word, BibleTruth200@gmail.com. And I could imagine I could take a little picture of this and I could send it to you if you wanted to follow those. And it gives you about 4 or 5 years here, 5 years with the dates of all the feasts. So it's really handy, and you can probably find it online as well. Okay, now Pentecost like I said, is the only annual holy day that does not fall on a fixed calendar date. So instead, what we have to do is to count the days. And Pentecost does mean 50, or to count to 50, count 50. So we need a starting point. And you may say, well, this is like, what does this have to do with me? Well, again, it's like a lot of these other things in the Bible that you may not you may not partake of something every day, but you should be aware of it. You should know that it exists. You should have you have some understanding of the history that is in the Bible. And so there's a little history here, but this is also what we would actually do if we say we didn't have the calendar dates, available to us. You'd have to, like in the old days, that they had to count these days. So a starting point here would be looking at the lunar calendar. It shows, of course, Passover, like this year, April 8th, and then of course the next day is April 9th. So those are 2 key dates. So we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread immediately following Passover, and it begins and ends with an annual Sabbath. Now understand the weekly Saturday Sabbath falls in the middle of these 2 annual Sabbaths, and so the Bible explains that, and it's a bit difficult to understand, but you can find other explanations probably, in other like other books or pamphlets or manuals, or it wouldn't take long to kind of figure out, how to get it done correctly. It's really important that you also do keep Pentecost on the correct date, and it is always a Sunday. And so what we're doing, we're going to count we take the Sabbath, the Saturday Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. It's not the annual. It's really important not to mistakenly use the beginning or the ending annual Sabbath day of unleavened bread, but to use that Saturday, which falls within the middle of those 2 days. And so what we do is to just simply you want to count 7 Sabbath days, or 50 days. So if you counted from the Sunday immediately following that weekly Sabbath in that week of Passover, so at the end of the week, you count 7 Saturdays, 7 Sabbath Saturdays, and that's 7 times 7 is 49, and then you just move to the next day, which is Sunday, and that'd be 50 days. So you can either count weeks, you could count the days, you could count probably I count the Saturdays, and then just move over to the next to the Sunday. It's the immediate Sunday following. So it's 50 days, or 7. It's 7 weeks, 7 Sabbath days, Sabbath days following that Passover unleavened. Those 2 beginning the Passover day, and then the first day of unleavened bread. That's you would be within that day, and the last day, the 7th day of unleavened bread. Okay, I know it's a bit confusing, but if you took a look at it, it can be worked out pretty well. But I mention it because I think you should just be aware of it. That's really the main reason that you should really understand it. Usually, and of course, Passover always falls. It seems most likely it's going to fall like in the March, April time period, and then Pentecost falls within the April-May period. Now, I want to do a little, just a little summary here. Now, Passover was symbolized by Christ's sacrifice. So that was for the remission of sins. And so, of course, what he did was to pardon us or to forgive us of our sins. But following Passover, of course, immediately following is the days of unleavened bread. And that's pictured, that pictures the putting away of sin. And so it doesn't, while Jesus on the cross, his sacrifice was about remission of sins and giving us a pardon. Unleavened bread is basically pictures for us to stop sinning. And unleavened bread is all about removing the unleaven from bread. And so for a week, for that 1 week period of time, including plus that 1 day of Passover, you're not to consume any leaven. So many people, many families remove all leaven products. When I say all, I mean all leaven products from their home. And leaven is synonymous with sin. And you remember coming out of Egypt, Egypt is considered sin, and because of the nature of that time that Israelites spent time there. And so if you come out of Egypt, you're coming out of sin. You're doing away with your leaven. You're coming out of sin. That's the whole idea. It is to stop sinning. And so let's. And then what I did, I had a lot of information that I had sorted out from different sources, and then I found, and I was going to go through that with you, but then I found this in a little pamphlet that I was looking at. It kind of summarized everything, so I just want to read that to you. It'll probably be a little more thorough than I might have been. So let's read it. So this is, again, I'm summarizing here, and then we'll be all done. So Pentecost pictures the first part of the spiritual harvest, the calling out of the church, the called out ones, which for the New Testament dispensation began on Sunday, Pentecost, June 17 of AD 31. And on that day, the Holy Spirit came to dwell within flesh as prophesied by Joel. On the 50th day, which is Pentecost, in Old Testament times, 2 wave loaves, and you can find this, you might want to look at this in Leviticus 23:17 and 20. So those 2 wave loaves were brought out of the habitations of the congregation. So rather than thinking about taking a couple stalks of barley out of the field and then holding them up to the Lord for his approval, it almost reads like maybe the first of the harvest was actually prepared in an oven, because I think that's what I think of as loaves, and I didn't see where it was defined any better than that. So we'll just, I guess we don't have to really worry about it because we don't do that today. But it's nice to understand what did occur, a couple thousand years ago. So the habitations, I would believe, would refer to someone's home. Anyway, so the habitations of the congregation as the first fruits unto the Lord. Just so the New Testament church was gathered out of this world as the first fruits of his salvation in fulfillment of the meaning of the wave loaves. So Jesus, of course, was the first fruit, and then following Jesus, we will be first fruits that Jesus he's going to call out. So he's called us out. He's chosen. He will choose. I think the Bible describes it, him being in the process. We're being tested. We know that we have things to do. We have commandments to keep, statutes to keep. We have the sayings of Jesus to understand. There's a lot that God is asking us to understand and to walk in, and so that's being addressed here. So we have, continuing on, we have all, if we have been converted. So for those of us who have been converted, we become a part of that New Testament church. We have become part of what was symbolized by those wave loaves. And just as the wave sheaf was lifted up into the air and waved towards Christ, towards heaven, symbolizing Christ's trip to heaven and return, so the wave loaves were lifted up and waved, symbolizing that we too shall for a moment leave this solid earth when we ascend to meet him in the air. So now 1 Thessalonians 4:16 refers to our the resurrection that we all look forward to. But what's interesting here, and I haven't seen this before in the Bible, um, but this phrase, this return, well, let me read it to you and then comment on it. Uh, so, when we ascend to meet him in the air, before we return with him to stand on the Mount of Olives as he begins his millennial rule. Now, if you didn't catch that, uh, before we return with him to stand on the Mount of Olives, that means that at the resurrection that I've indicated before, if you read John 3, verse, I think about 3 through 8, it takes you through being born again. And you're not born again until you are resurrected. And we are resurrected as you'd be not like, but as the angels are spirit beings. We will be spirit beings. Those of us who qualify and who are resurrected. And so it shows that we will return. The dead in Christ will, of course, rise first, and then those who are alive who qualify would be raised up. They would be brought up into the sky and in the clouds to meet the return of Jesus. And then they return back to the Mount of Olives. And he begins, that's where God begins his millennial rule. Now, you might want to look at Zechariah speaks to the, and Zechariah 14, verse 3 and 4. But look at the verses, a couple, one or two before that, maybe verse 1, 2, and then maybe 4 and 5. I believe that there's a little bit of more explanation there about shows the Mount of Olives. So at least you can connect that verse I'm referring to, as well as what is being said here. And also Acts 1:11. So that shows that, I think what's interesting here is that we're waiting for the resurrection. We'd be resurrected as spirit beings, but then we come back to earth. And so I don't know, I don't believe, from what I understand, we would, remember, Jesus goes on to battle against, there will be a big battle that, we read about in Revelation, about the 200 million man army. This will be put out by both the Chinese and the Russians. And they will supply those 200 million men, and God is going to use those two armies to punish the European army, who's going to mete out God's punishment to us here in the United States, United Kingdom, and also Judah, or what we call Israel in the Middle East. They're really Judah, and they're part of who Israel is in the Bible. We are Israel. If you read the Bible, you can see it can be proven that the Bible identifies the United States and Great Britain as Israel, but biblical Israel. Okay, so I'm starting to get off track here, but Jesus is going to go to fight those guys and finish them off, and that will be the end of war. That'll be it. No more wars after that. And we will be with them, or when I say we, those people who qualify to fight with him. Sounds like very exciting. Well, very exciting. I can't think of anything much more exciting than to be with the Lord and go do battle against the enemy of God. Wow. Anyway, so let's see. Okay. Oh yeah, I think, did I tell you? Take a look at Leviticus 23. 17 and 20, if I didn't already tell you that, and to learn a little more about the New what's going on, with all these events and all this activity that makes up this annual feast called Pentecost. And so let's not forget that Apostle Paul kept the feast. If you're wondering, well, why should I keep it? Well, because we're in that same time period that describes Apostle Paul and Jesus. Apostle Paul in Acts 20:16 and a couple other locations describes him keeping the feast. I think he was at Ephesus, like the Ephesians. He was going to stop there, or he was going to lay over there before he went, I believe it was to Jerusalem, to keep that feast. And of course, I know Jesus kept the feast as well, all of them. So if Jesus, again, I always say if Jesus is our best example, if he does something, then apparently we should be doing it as well. And let's not forget that we are commanded by God to keep these days as a statute, these feast days as a statute forever. Okay, that's what it says. Look at Leviticus 23, verses 14, 21, 31, and 41. Look at those 4 verses. They include God's command to keep these days as a statute forever. That's statute is a law, and that's God's commandment. And so anyway, that's my overview. That's a 25-minute overview of Pentecost. It doesn't I haven't shared everything that applies here or is pertinent, but it gives you an overview. It gives you a pretty good idea of what Pentecost is about. So it's all about first fruits. It's about being called out. It's about those people who are going to be called by God, by Jesus when He returns, and it just shows you how we started with the offering of 2,000 years ago to now the calling out. So that's where we fit in, and that's a big deal for us. And so as you'll see, if I'm able to go through the rest of the feast during the year, it'll paint. It's a very good picture of what really God is looking for in all of us, and these feasts help show you that. Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate you listening. And again, if you want this card that I referred to, you can contact me at Bible Truth 200, BibleTruth200 @gmail.com, and I'd be happy. I could probably snap a picture of this with my phone and send it to you. Both sides, I'll send it to you. Otherwise, you can find this stuff online, and also you can get the Passover date, off the calendar, and then you can just work with that as well. Okay, so thank you again. Talk to you later. Okay, bye.